hydrologist with the MPCA. That is a title he will not be able to claim much longer because Mike is retiring in, I think, about less than a month here. Right, Mike?
About a month, yep.
Yeah. Mike has probably, it's fair to say, has forgotten more about stormwater, groundwater monitoring, and remediation than I will ever know. He earned his doctorate degree from what was then the Soil Science Department at the University of Minnesota, and that's where we first met those many years ago. And he spent 15 years on groundwater issues before moving on to stormwater for the past 16 years now. He is primarily interested in understanding the fate of water and water pollutants in the environment and working to maintain the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. And today, Mike is going to be talking about the role of green stormwater infrastructure in climate resiliency. Mike, it is a pleasure to have you here with us for what may be your last seminar. I don't know, but it is a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. It's always a pleasure to present. I remember way back in my college days and being very nervous about presenting, and it kind of becomes old hat after a while. And it's actually kind of fun to get up and have the opportunity to share information. So I'm going to share my screen here if I'm lucky. Being an old guy, you never know what's going to happen when you start hitting buttons. But can you see my screen okay? Okay, good. Okay, so as Mark mentioned, the title of my talk is the role of green stormwater infrastructure, or what is GSI, the acronym, in climate resiliency. I gave a version of this talk last fall at the University of Minnesota. I've kind of updated it a little bit, modified it for this audience. So why am I giving this talk? Well, this is kind of my stormwater guidance timeline. And if you go back to the early 2000s in stormwater, we were primarily focused on the engineering aspects of stormwater. How do you build something? How do you design it? And about 10 years ago, we started moving into the world of pollutant reductions. How do we quantify it? Total maximum daily loads. How do we comply with our permit requirements? And the questions we were asking, well, how do I reduce my pollutant load? For those of you who are familiar with the Minimal Impact Design Standard, or MIDS, that was the time when that was developed. And so today now, though, we're kind of moving into the world of sustainability and more systems types of approaches. How do I manage phosphorus at the watershed scale, for example? So it's not just one rain garden, it's street sweeping and rain gardens and permeable pavement and residential practices and all of that stuff. And how does that all work together? And how do I incorporate multiple benefits? Not just stormwater treatment, but habitat and climate resiliency. And so it's the climate aspect that I'm going to focus on today. Here's the outline for my talk. I'm going to go through some definitions and background because I know some folks here are not stormwater people. What is climate resiliency and what are some perceptions about green stormwater infrastructure and climate? Just a brief overview of the potential climate impacts in urban areas, and then the bulk of the presentation on number 4, addressing climate impacts with green stormwater infrastructure. Just one slide, I believe, on information and research needs, and then hopefully some time for questions and answers. So if you're in the world of stormwater and green infrastructure and sustainability and all that, it's kind of an alphabet soup of terms. And here's just a listing. This is from Taguchi at the University of Minnesota a couple of years ago. He published this. No need to learn all of these. It's just an example of all the literature that's out there. For example, you have complete streets, which I don't know if that means half the side is paved and the other half isn't. Smart cities as opposed to dumb cities. I don't know what half these terms mean. So what is green stormwater infrastructure? Well, the way I define it, and you can find many definitions in the literature, but it's stormwater practices that use natural systems or engineered systems that mimic or use natural processes to capture, clean, infiltrate stormwater, shade and cool surfaces, reduce flooding, create habitat, provide a multitude of ecosystem and social services. The focus of this presentation is on urban stormwater, and you can see some images here of traditional gray infrastructure and then green infrastructure. So what are some example practices? So bioretention or rain gardens, tree trenches like the tree trench system in St. Paul along the Green Line, that's a massive tree trench system. Vegetated swales and filter strips. Permeable pavement seems a little odd because it's not green, but if it's designed to infiltrate stormwater, it is a green stormwater infrastructure practice. Constructed wetlands, harvest and use or reuse systems, green roof. So these are some examples of green stormwater infrastructure practices. Some other terms. Now these I am going to spend a minute on because I think these are some terms that are worth learning. Green stormwater infrastructure is one piece of the green infrastructure component. Green infrastructure itself can include things like energy, LEED buildings, and so forth. So green stormwater infrastructure is just one part of the whole green infrastructure puzzle. You'll see these terms like low impact development. These are designed to mimic natural systems, nature-based solutions, which are sustainably managing our ecosystems, and blue infrastructure, which are water-based systems, yellow infrastructure, which are solar-based, and then better site design, which is when you're going to come and develop a new site, how can you reduce the imperviousness? How can you preserve the natural systems that are there? And really, all of this really just ties into the whole concept of sustainability, which is, of course, using resources in a manner that does not compromise the resources for future generations. And so this is all really about sustainability, which is where we have to go eventually. What is climate resiliency? Well, we're all aware that the climate is changing. The climate has always changed for 4.5+ billion years, but it's the change over the last 50 years that's been most alarming. You can see this is air temperature increases globally. They've gone up about 1 degree Celsius over the last 50 years, which is a pretty significant change relative to time on Earth here. There are other measures that don't get mentioned as much in the news and so forth. If you look at global ocean heat content, for example, you can see that it also is on the rise. I couldn't find any good data on soil, but there is some information out there that we're seeing on a global scale, soil temperatures increase too. So it's not just the air temperature, but everything's changing. This definition is out of Wikipedia. Climate resiliency, the capacity of social, economic, and ecosystems to cope with a hazardous event or trend. And so it includes both mitigation and adaptation. So we have these perceptions that are out there. Green stormwater infrastructure has limited climate resiliency capacity. Well, if you build a rain garden to capture 1 inch of rain off of an impervious surface, and you get a 6-inch rain, yes, it's going to get swamped out. It's not going to help you with that flooding event. We also see this perception that green stormwater infrastructure is going to resolve all our climate-related impacts, and that is not true either. What we're seeing, though, is we're seeing changes. Things aren't static. We have new designs. We have new approaches. We have creativity entering into the stormwater world. And so, as I mentioned in my abstract, the truth is somewhere in the middle here. GSI can certainly help with climate resiliency. It's not the only piece in the puzzle, though. The 5 impacts that are definitely related to climate in urban areas include flooding, drought, hydrologic changes, water quality, and increased temperature. I'll just touch on each of these real briefly before I get into the GSI part of the talk. So increased flooding is associated primarily with what we call extreme precipitation events. These are the big events that kind of swamp out our systems. And it's the #1 climate concern among practitioners. And the most common approach so far has been to size up infrastructure, make it bigger. This is an image from Duluth and the big flood that they had several years ago now. And I want to focus on the image on the right here. I don't know if my mouse is working or not here. But if you look at TP40, which is in the blue, this is rainfall data through 1961, and you can see the 2-year 24-hour event and the 50-year 24-hour event here. Atlas 14 came along and updated it through 2013. You can see the 2-year 24-hour event didn't change very much, just a slight increase. The 50-year 24-hour event went up considerably, about an inch, which is something on the order of 15 to 20%. And so these types of events that we're concerned about, these big events that are leading to flooding problems. Drought is a tough one to figure out. It's really hard to associate climate change with the drought and severity and so forth. If you look at the U.S. drought monitor, you'll see that a significant chunk of the U.S. is in a drought state often. I don't know historically if that's more or less, but it does seem that we are susceptible to longer, more severe droughts over the past 20 years or so. And of course, the effects are reduced water supply, ecosystem degradation, health impacts, increased energy demand, and reduced food production. As I mentioned, this was a tough one to look at, though. So if you look at the U.S. Drought Monitor from October of last year and February of this year, you can see that things changed really quickly. In this case, look at the West Coast, in particular California, and within a period of 4 months, they haven't completely escaped their drought, but you can see that they've gotten a considerable amount of drought relief associated with an El Nino that was not predicted by our climatologists, because it's getting harder and harder to predict things like El Ninos. In fact, I thought going back to last fall, they were actually predicting a mild La Nina year, and it turns out that we're seeing some El Nino effects here. So a lot of rain in California, and they need it, so good for them. Hydrologic changes they're complicated in urban areas. You often see these images that say that, well, we've got more impervious surface in urban areas, and so we get less recharge and less groundwater recharge. Well, that's not always true, particularly in older cities where there's a lot of leakage in the systems. This is an image of all the factors that enter into the groundwater equation in an urban area. And so we've got stormwater infiltration, but we've got leakage through pervious and impervious surfaces. As I was just talking to Mark, I've never seen potholes so bad now. Every one of those potholes stores water, and eventually that water can seep into our groundwater system. It's considered to be impervious, but they're not impervious surfaces. And of course, our pipes, especially in older cities, all leak. So a lot of studies actually show that urban recharge has actually gone up over time in some places, as opposed to what's traditionally thought that go down. For those of you who attended a talk on Lake Superior about a month or so ago, the speaker mentioned that slight changes in air temperature can lead to significant changes in ice cover on the lake. We see the same thing in stormwater. If you look at this image, we've got runoff on the y-axis, and it's normalized, and we've got air temperature on the x-axis. And you can see this is runoff. If we change our air temperature even just slightly from -5 to 0, you can see the sharp increase in the amount of runoff that's being generated. And this is what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of more midwinter thaws, and I think that's partly responsible for these potholes that we're seeing. But it's these thaws that can lead to significant recharge events during the winter that never happened before, just because of slight temperature changes in our air. Much of our hydrology in urban areas is engineered, so the climate itself is really not as much the factor as what we do with the water on the landscape. Do we put more impervious surfaces? Do we keep our roads in good shape? Do we keep our pipes tight underneath the land surface? Things like that That's what's going to affect our hydrology in urban areas. Water quality changes. Rarely do you get R-squareds of 0.93 in the environmental world. This is from the Miller Creek TMDL, and you can see that as air temperature increases on the x-axis, the stream temperature increases on the y-axis in a very, very strong relationship. So as our air temperature increases, we're going to see our water temperatures increase too. And other changes are related to the length of dry weather events and as well as increased runoff volumes. There isn't a lot of research on the relationship between stormwater runoff and the effects on surface water from a water quality perspective. I'll walk you through these images. They're a little bit complicated, but not really. So air temperature increases globally looks to be about 1 to 3 higher in urban areas than in the surrounding rural areas. This image here shows very large cities, Tokyo, New York, Moscow, and anything to the right of this vertical line here shows that the temperatures in the city, in the urban area, are greater than in the surrounding rural areas. And so you can see in every case here, except for Cairo, that in these large cities, we're seeing shifts in urban temperatures on the order of up to five or more degrees Celsius compared to the surrounding rural areas. So this is the heat island effect. These are very large cities, so it's more pronounced in them. Another image, again, I'll walk you through it. You can ignore the gray lines. Look at the two darker lines. The upper one, which is the darkest line, shows the temperature in the urban streams, and the darker line shows the temperatures in the rural areas near this urban area. So you can see that typically temperatures in urban streams are about 2 degrees warmer than in the surrounding surface waters near that urban area. But what's really interesting in this graph to me is you get a rainfall here, and all of a sudden in the urban, you get a mild increase in temperature in the rural area, but you get this huge spike in temperature in the urban area associated with the rainfall event. And of course, that's the pavement. This is in May, late May, and I believe this study came out of some eastern cities. You can see this big spike associated with pavement that's really warmed up. And of course, there are effects associated with that, human health effects, energy demand, and so forth. So anyways, the bulk of my talk then is going to be on this, well, what can GSI do to address these climate effects that we're seeing? And we have 5 strategies in our toolbox. Infiltration, storage, detention, vegetation management, and soil and media management. So we'll start with infiltration. So how does the stormwater infiltration practice work? Well, you've got runoff coming from the right side here. Some of it, most of it goes into this inflow into this practice. This practice is designed to store a certain amount of water, maybe 1 inch, maybe 1.1 inch, which is the MIDS standard. And that water that's captured eventually infiltrates because we have a very porous media here. And it's supposed to infiltrate within 48 hours. Typically, it will infiltrate much quicker than that. Not all the water is captured. Typically, these devices are designed to capture about 90% of our annual runoff from impervious surfaces. So about 10% of it just simply bypasses the system and doesn't get treated. Typical infiltration practices include bio-infiltration or rain gardens, permeable pavement over a tree trench. This is the green line, so there's a tree trench system here. And then we got swales here with impermeable check dams that store the water. Behind these check dams, the water is then allowed to infiltrate. So we've got lots of infiltration practices. So what can we do to enhance our climate resiliency using infiltration? Well, most of our models, I shouldn't say models, but in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, we have these tables that give infiltration rates of soils. And it's a one-dimensional infiltration rate. And we know in reality that infiltration is 3-dimensional in nature. So we're really undercrediting these practices if we're only looking at it. So infiltration is dynamic. We should be crediting the three-dimensional flow in this. We have restrictions in our permit that you can't infiltrate on certain types of soils if the rate is too fast. But if the water quality that's passing through that infiltration system is appropriate and meets water quality standards, why would we limit ourselves to infiltrating water? Let's infiltrate as much as we can. And you can see, I don't know if you can read this or not, but this is a 2021 amended Minneapolis Code of Ordinances. And what it says is it's encouraging a banking approach, which is anybody who goes beyond their permit requirement. So if they have to capture 1 inch of rain, but they can capture 3 inches of rain, they can bank that 2 inches, that extra 2 inches, and they can get some sort of credit for it. I believe Capital Region Watershed District has a banking approach too, where they can bank infiltration in one area, and they might have another area in the watershed where they can't get as much infiltration. So they'll get as much as they can there, and they'll get more than they need to get by permit in other areas. So let's promote as much infiltration as we can, provided the water quality that's entering into through the practice meets water quality standards. We see on some soils where we have limited infiltration capacity, we're now seeing new designs that allow us to store water. So we build this practice here to capture this amount of water, but let's build some internal storage off to the side of this practice where we can store a little extra water, let this water bleed through. And if we get a dry period, let's say it doesn't rain for a week, the rest of this water can then infiltrate into the system. So we're building extra storage capacity into the system. Historically, we've relied a lot on what we call soil probes, and so we get a boring, and we determine from that boring if it's a sand, a clay, a silt, whatever. We're really trying to encourage people, and Brooke, of course, did her master's work on this. We're encouraging people to go out and measure your actual infiltration rates in the field. Identify on your site where the best place is to infiltrate, and then infiltrate as much water as you can at that site, again, provided it meets water quality standards. So we really want people to get out in the field and start understanding their site instead of using information out of tables and manuals and books. Minimize inlet bypass. So if you remember that image I showed you where water bypasses the system, build your system so that you capture as much water as you can. Now this might cause temporary street flooding. You see this practice here, the water really has nowhere to go except into this practice. And you're gonna get temporary flooding here. But that seems a small price to pay for getting as much water into this. Hopefully it's draining into a stormwater practice where it'll get treated. And it's a small price to pay, I think, for storing that water, not just simply letting it bypass and run off into a receiving water. So again, a new design. So how good is infiltration for impacting these climate-related factors? Infiltration is probably, along with maybe soil manipulation, the strongest, the best tool we have in our toolbox. It has significant impacts on water quality for surface receiving waters. It can significantly increase groundwater recharge if it's done right. It certainly has very positive impacts on temperatures, and it has some other effects on drought, flooding, and it can reduce energy demand. It doesn't do anything for carbon sequestration or air quality. So let's look at storage. So this is holding stormwater runoff back for an intended use other than rate control. So what is rate control? If you look at this image here, before urbanization shown in the red or whatever color that is, you see the hydrograph during a rain event is kind of smooth and it's steady here. In an urban area, when you don't have any detention and storage in the system, you get this sharp peak and then a sharp release. And so you get a flatter curve down here. This is called rate control, though. When you put in a device like this, you can never get back to a natural system before urbanization, but you can smooth out this part of the hydrograph by holding water back, and that's what's called rate control. We're controlling the rate at which water is released. Well, storage is not rate control. I just wanted to show that image because storage is actually capturing the water and then using it for something. This is an image from Target Field where the Twins play. This water is stored in these tanks and it's used to irrigate the field, and I believe some of it's used for indoor flushing too. I'm not sure about that, but I know the Saint Stadium downtown St. Paul does kind of the same thing. So harvest and use systems, although they're primarily used for irrigation, they can be used for other things like indoor uses, irrigation of ball fields and things like that. Wetlands can also store water for flood control, and wetlands are a real key component of the whole water storage image or picture here. So I'm going to talk about these two separately, storage and harvesting approaches. One approach with harvesting, so our traditional constructed ponds, we kind of build them and make them a little bit deep and so forth, but now we're seeing some new designs where we extend these benches out farther to capture and store water, and then slowly allow it to be used for irrigation or possibly indoor uses or whatever. So all of this water that's out here on these extended benches is now storage beyond what was used for traditional constructed stormwater practice. This is an interesting study. So this is a small watershed. You can see 2 kilometers here. So it's about 12, 14 kilometers across by maybe 8 kilometers this way. And they did this study, and what they looked at was, well, how should we do harvesting and reuse across this watershed? Should we do it at the residential scale, and that would be something like a rain barrel? Or should we do it at the more local scale, which would be bigger storage tanks? And what they found was that in some places where you see a lot of blue, it's better to do the harvesting at the lot scale. So let's put in rain barrels at these locations. But in these other areas where you've got more red, it's better to put in a neighborhood storage system that could be used by the whole neighborhood, for example. This is an interesting study because it shows that it's a multi-dimensional approach to harvesting across an entire watershed, not just a static approach that we've kind of used in the past. We're seeing new designs like these blue-green roofs. So what's a blue-green roof? Well, a green roof, of course, is one that has vegetation on it. It captures rainwater and allows it to be stored in the soil and eventually used by plants for, their purposes of evapotranspiration. But if we couple that with the blue part of it, which is storage, the storage can be on the roof itself. And of course, then we've got to structurally make sure the roof is intact, or we can have a storage device down below too. So it's combining, again, a green roof with a blue component, which is the storage and the harvesting component. So again, new designs, new concepts. Wetlands, I think, are really going to be an important component of this, and it's not going to be a popular thing. It's going to be a lot of resistance to this, but we have to kind of start rebuilding our wetlands and in urban core areas. The Chinese are much ahead of us in this concept. This is an example of a wetland on a chart, urban wetland in a large Chinese city. It's built right into the core of the city. It provides many benefits from a hydrologic standpoint, but it's also from an aesthetic standpoint, social benefits. People use these for recreational purposes. They go there for their lunches. It creates habitat. A multifunctional wetland here, a very large wetland in this urban core area in this large Chinese city. So we're starting to finally catch on to this concept here in the United States. Another new design that we're seeing is the use of connecting wetlands. So there's a wetland down here and there's one upstream here, but connecting these wetlands in urban areas. This is an urban area. It doesn't look like it, but it is. And it's connected by this swale system, which has check dams to slow the water down. So we're allowing the water to be stored, to bleed slowly into the next storage unit and so forth. So getting back to a more natural concept here. And the one that's not going to be very popular, but I think we really have to go here, is people are just going to have to stop building in areas that are prone to floods. California, some cities in California and Surrey, California, have reestablished their wetlands along some of their streams. They've kicked the people out of those areas, said, sorry, can't build here anymore. And they rebuilt their wetlands. And I think this is something that we're going to have to do in the future. And again, it's not going to be popular, but maybe we shouldn't have built there in the first place. If we're going to be getting 6-8 inch rainstorms, how are we going to deal with them? And storage can affect, it's really strong for relieving drought. This is probably its most beneficial use, but it also can have positive impacts on flooding and on water quality. Detention, I'm not going to talk a lot about. It's just basically holding water back temporarily and releasing it. It's called rate control. I talked about that earlier. Green roofs are really good rate control practices, but of course, you can't put green roofs across your entire city. So that's the limitation with green roofs, is their extent is limited. But where they do exist, they're very, very good detention practices. And constructed ponds, these are designed to hold water back temporarily and slowly release it. And then swales with permeable check dams, sorry. And this is where water can pass through those check dams very slowly. Underground storage vaults, these are really gray infrastructure, but typically they can be combined with green infrastructure, and they're generally designed to temporarily hold water back too. Some things we can do with detention is we can manipulate our green roof, our media, for example. What's the sweet spot here? So we're looking at the media depth. The more the soil you put on a green roof, the more it costs. Obviously, you have to start building, considering structural components. You start putting 10 inches of media on a green roof, it's got to really be sound, versus plant available water. So we want to hit this sweet spot here where we balance the amount of media that we're putting with the amount of plant available water that we can get. So a lot of research being done in that area. And again, looking at pond design, modifying our pond design to consider 25 and 100-year level floods. And then I mentioned permeable check dams. I brushed through detention pretty quickly because it really has fairly minimal. It has a little bit of an impact on flooding and water quality, but it's probably the weakest tool we have in our toolbox. So I talked about all of these practices and really didn't talk about the vegetation. It's something that's been kind of ignored, not just in these previous slides, but in our industry in general. We really haven't done as much with vegetation as we probably could. But almost all green stormwater infrastructure practices include a vegetative component. And you can see some pictures here on the bottom. This image on the upper right here shows interception, and this is out of a study from Hathaway in Tennessee. Recently, interception and stem flow and the amount of rainfall that's captured. So as you increase rainfall, you can see that there's a relationship here that interception and stem flow increases. Here in Minnesota, our deciduous trees on an annual basis capture, through interception alone, capture about 30% of our annual rainfall. So the more urban canopy we can put out there, the more interception we're going to get from that canopy. If you look at the image on the right here, again, evapotranspiration on the y-axis, the type of vegetation on the x-axis, grasses and herbaceous. Now we put in woody plants, and you can see that we're increasing our evapotranspiration significantly by putting in things like trees. And of course, carbon sequestration is an important consideration here with vegetation. I'll talk a little bit about infiltration in a bit here. And I mentioned vegetation provides a lot of other benefits, habitat, carbon sequestration. And so we really want to start maximizing vegetation in our system. So how can we do that? Well, traditionally, our rain gardens, we always thought, well, no, we're going to put in grasses, sedges, some perennial vegetation maybe, but now we've realized that, hey, we can put trees or shrubs in these practices. And so now we're really encouraging people to start to put in these trees, shrubs that can provide more retainage of the runoff that's captured in these vegetated systems. Reducing turf or modified turf practices, it won't happen in my lifetime, but I think that in 50 years, that turf is going to be a bit of a dinosaur, hopefully in urban areas. We're seeing, or if not, we're going to see modified turf that is better at holding water and sequestering carbon. The turf varieties that we've used historically are, I don't want to say worthless, but they're pretty close to worthless from an ecosystem standpoint. They don't capture much water. They don't provide much habitat. They're shallow rooting. They're just not very good practices from an environmental standpoint. So getting rid of the turf or modifying our turf practices, I think we're going to see a lot of that in the future. I used to get bad vibes from my neighbors when my creeping Charlie and my clover extended in my yard. Now I give them the bad vibes when they're out putting the pesticides on their turf. Multi-layering our systems, putting in tree canopy and then putting underneath that these modified practices that I'm talking about, these modified turf practices. Urban gardening, we're seeing more and more of that. Harvesting and storing carbon. So don't pick up every leaf in your yard. Keep the nutrient cycle going, but don't blow them into the street. Take them to the compost or compost them yourself. You're storing carbon by doing that. And finally, we're seeing foresters, ecologists, landscape architects brought into the discussion. I don't have anything against engineers. We need engineers. These are mostly engineered systems. But up until about the last 5 to 10 years, we really haven't brought foresters and ecologists and landscape architects to the table. And we're seeing more and more of that now. Almost every city in Minnesota, medium to large city, now has an urban forestry program. And a lot of them have tree protection ordinances and so forth. So this is encouraging. Vegetation impacts almost everything. Maybe not to a huge degree, but certainly to some extent. So these pie charts can be additive in some extent. So if I have another practice that has a quarter pie for water quality, and I add vegetation to my system, maybe I get another eighth of a pie added to that. So these pie charts are somewhat additive to some extent. So any one of these practices is not going to solve the problem, but putting them together will help. And then soil and media management. So I'm an old soil scientist, and we treat our soils like dirt, and you've probably heard that 1,000 times. But urban soils are just kind of a mess. Nonetheless, it's the largest carbon pool in urban areas, and it's rarely carbon saturated, which means we can put a lot more carbon back into our soils. And many stormwater practices utilize engineered media. And of course, our soils affect infiltration, storage, detention, vegetation. They affect everything. Soils really are the basis for everything that we build in these urban systems. And urban soils are sealed, they're contaminated, they're disturbed. We have remnants of them left. They're really in bad shape. And I think we're finally starting to realize that we got to start doing something about our urban soils. This table on the lower right shows, for example, the increase in bulk density that you get from different types of practices. And if you go down here to an athletic field, for example, you're increasing your bulk density by 0.38 to 0.54. So what's a good bulk density? Well, about 1.1, maybe somewhere in there, 1.2. So anything beyond 1.5, and your plants are going to really struggle to get their roots down through it. So if you're going from 1.1 to 1.5, 1.6 on an athletic field, or if you've got construction with mass grading where you're increasing your bulk density by about 0.3, you're really making it tough for water to infiltrate for plants to grow. So I'm going to talk about the hydrology of soils and then the carbon aspect of soils. So let's look at the decrease that you get in bulk density by doing different things. Well, we can till, and that has a little bit of an impact, but the best things we can do are to revegetate and to compost, add compost. When we do that, we get back 0.25 to 0.35 on our bulk density. And that's overcoming most of what you saw in the previous slide. So we can relieve compaction, we can add amendments like compost and biochar, and we can modify our surface by tilling, but that has a moderate effect. If you're gonna till, though, if you look at this chart here with the bar charts, if you're gonna till, make sure you till deep. So you got the reference soil, the RS soils here, and if you're gonna, and you can see that if you subsoil the SS here, it has a very strong impact on the vegetation and the infiltration. The bulk densities stay about the same. The infiltration goes up compared to if we only till the topsoil. And if we do deep subsoiling, we can increase the vegetation. So if you are going to till, make sure you do it deep into the soil. And then converting land on development, preserving our green spaces, minimizing compaction, and establishing vegetation. Vegetation is really a cure for a lot of things. And again, bring the soil scientists to the table. They've been ignored, I think, for a long time. How about carbon? What can we do to increase our carbon? Biochar. It's kind of the new wave. So if you look at total carbon and you compare that, and over time, you can see that the total carbon, if you're adding biochar and green waste to your soil, you're going to keep your carbon content up considerably compared to other practices. And this image here also shows again that with athletic fields, if you and ornamental lawns, if you can increase your vegetation and keep the soil uncompacted, that you're going to increase your carbon significantly. It's just opening up that soil and allowing it to capture some of that carbon. Again, preserve and create green spaces in converting land. This image on the right shows an example of extractable carbon in a soil. These are developed, and this is also a developed site, but it's a site where you've maintained and preserved as much vegetation. It's a green space site. And you can see that the amount of carbon in this soil is significantly greater than in these other soils that are developed, and a lot of that carbon is in organic form. And soil really is important. You see a lot of dark here compared to some of the previous practices. I think it's probably comparable to infiltration in terms of how important it is in our toolbox. And it can do a lot for carbon too, which of course is something that we want to try to do. So let's put it all together. Can GSI help alleviate impacts of climate change? Yes. How? Preserve and increase green spaces. Restrict development in flood-prone areas. Improve the designs of existing practices. You've seen a half a dozen or more examples of new designs that we're seeing in these practices. Watershed scale treatment trains. So let's look at things from a watershed scale instead of just a site scale. That harvest study that I talked about earlier was a good example. A big component of this is getting the homeowner to buy into this. How are we going to educate and get our homeowners to understand all of this, and so that they can practice GSI at their own site scale? And then we need better modeling for all of this. Just a couple images here of some cities. And we can't throw gray infrastructure out the window. Green infrastructure is not going to solve our problem. People sometimes ask me that, well, can you quantify the impacts of green stormwater infrastructure? And I say, well, it's really hard. It's going to vary. But if I had to throw a number out, if I had to throw a number out there to save my life, I'd say we can probably take 2.5 to 3 inches off at those intense rain events. So you get a 6-inch rain, you're not going to get all of that 6 inches with green stormwater infrastructure. But if you do things right, if you do some of these things that I've talked about, we can maybe get 2.5 to 3 inches of that. And then implementing all these provide other ecosystem services. I've talked about climate, but there's all this other stuff, habitat, aesthetics, air quality, all of that enters in. We need to start looking at things from a more sustainability perspective. And of course, the whole social equity thing comes into play. A lot of these social justice issues, and if you go to some of these areas in Central City, you can see very little green infrastructure, very little green period. And so we really need to kind of focus on prioritize those areas. This chart is an interesting chart here. I probably shouldn't have shown the bullet here, but it's the publications on green infrastructure from 1990 to 2020. So this is the number of publications in referee journals. And you can see that the number of publications over the last 10 years is gone up exponentially. We need to know more about vegetation. We need to know more about soil. And we need to know more about social issues. What is it going to take to get the public buy-in and involvement? So I think these are the areas where we always need research and everything, but if I was a researcher, I was 25 years old and start my career over, this is where I would be focusing on. And just a plug here for this Minneapolis-St. Paul long-term ecological research program. I believe it's only one of 2 long-term ecological research programs in the country. I believe the other one's in the Southwest, maybe Arizona. Lots of really important players in the whole sustainability, green stormwater infrastructure, green infrastructure for that matter, right here at the University of Minnesota. Reach out to them if you're interested in this topic. And so with that, I will entertain any questions that folks might have.
Well, thanks, Mike. That was very intriguing, and it was great to see all of your expertise put into a nice PowerPoint. And I always love all of the great images and photographs we get when we're talking about green infrastructure. We get to see lots of photos of good plants and soils. And are there any questions out there for Mike?
Hello, Mike. This is Aida. So my question is related to the infiltration. You said that I mean, just to study the infiltration in a field when you're going to do something on that field. So if you are not taking soil cores, how would you propose to do infiltration tests, and what would be more or less the density of those infiltration tests on a field? How many?
Well, that's one of the problems with soil, and that's one of the reasons why people don't do infiltration rates, is because you can take a measurement in one place, walk a meter to your left, and get an infiltration rate that is 2 orders magnitude higher or lower. Our manual does have guidance on a number of tests that you should take. John Gulliver would be a good contact. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but you should take at least a significant enough you should take enough measurements so that your standard deviation in the infiltration rate that you are determining starts to flatten out at the site. So if you take 4 measurements and you still get in a pretty high standard deviation, take another one, wait for that deviation to come down, and then you get a pretty good idea of what your infiltration rate is at the site. I personally would advocate for people not to use boring information anymore. Go out in the field and measure. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does.
And Ida, I did, as Mike mentioned in his presentation, my master's work on that, and we used a modified Philip-Dunn permeameter and found that we were getting pretty good infiltration measurements with that device, and we compared that to the double ring infiltrometer as well as actually flooding rain gardens and using a hydrant and actually seeing what the infiltration difference was between kind of all of these different devices, and that's in, I believe we've got that in the stormwater manual, but for sure the University of Minnesota has a book or a guidance they created called Assessing Stormwater Practices. And that goes into detail about all the different infiltration recommendations.
Yeah, and that
Thank you so
modified
much.
Philip-Dunn permeameter is really slick because you can take measurements very quickly. So you can take a lot of measurements on a site in a day, in a whole day. You could get the whole site characterized. Whereas double ring infiltrometers are really tedious.
Okay,
And
thank you.
heavy.
Thank you. I used those long time ago in Arizona and in Virginia. It was time consuming.
All right. It looks like we've got some questions in the chat for you, Mike. Kevin has a question. How do we do what you recommend through the MS4 program?
Talk to me in a month when I'm not working for the agency anymore. We got to get out and we got to start doing better outreach and communication. The agency is really good from a technical standpoint. We've got great technical staff. We got great staff, you know, and we're really good at writing permits and writing reports and stuff. We're not very good at communicating and outreach. We really need to get out and start doing more of that and start talking to folks and have them tell us, you know, what can they do to. A good example is Como Lake. I live in St. Paul and I walk around Como Lake and they got all these interpretive signs up and I see people stop at them all the time and read them. And that's what it's going to take to get people to do things. And the MS4 program, I think, should really, all of us should be encouraging people to take ownership. The government's not going to solve the problems. The people got to solve the problems. Sorry, that's kind of a sideways answer to your question, but.
And we've got another question here from Jeff that he's very interested in the examples you gave of constructed wetlands to help control flooding in urban areas. Can you speak to the design and or maintenance that is needed in constructed wetlands to ensure that they don't become water quality problems and pollutant sources, given that wetlands often go anaerobic and can recycle nutrients and other pollutants?
I think that's an area where we need more research. So I don't have a real good answer for you now, other than that the researchers are well aware that there are issues with that. For example, the University of Minnesota's Stormwater Research group is funding some research on constructed ponds and trying to make them more efficient for phosphorus retention. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you right now, but it's an area of active research. And maybe in 5 years, we'll have a better handle on how to design these practices to perform better from a hydrologic standpoint and sequester carbon. Ponds have been shown to be one of the few practices that, when they're maintained properly over the long term, can actually sequester carbon. And if they go aerobic and we release phosphorus, how can we deal with that? So yeah, these are unanswered questions. So sorry, I can't give you a great answer to that, other than that the researchers, they're kind of onto it.
All right, and we've got, looks like one last question here in the chat from Lizzie. Hi, Lizzie, nice to see you or know you're out there. Can you elaborate more on why water detention is a worse option for flooding?
Because you're still sending the same amount of water down. You're not taking the water off the landscape. You're slowing it down, so it's not getting someplace as fast, but in terms of volume, you're still sending the same amount of water downstream. So maybe it takes a little bit of the edge off of that flood, but if you got an 8-inch rain event, you're still going to end up with that 8 inches downstream somewhere, sometime. So I'm not saying it's a worthless practice. It's important to keep the water on the landscape for as long as you can. Ponds take up a lot of space too, so there's that aspect of it. So maybe some pond folks would disagree with me, but I just don't think from a green infrastructure standpoint, it's a very good tool in our toolbox.
This is Laura Melberg. I just wanted to follow up on that. So is it that the detention isn't good, or that it's going through a pipe right into the waterways instead of slower infiltration?
They're good. They're good for treatment. They treat the water. We're retaining solids. They're not real good for dissolved components. So they do perform a good job on retaining solids and any pollutants that are associated with the solids. So they are good from a treatment standpoint. And it is flattening that hydrograph to some extent. So they do have value. It's just that we're still sending the same amount of water downstream.
But are you saying we should use that same space to infiltrate and have a BMP that could actually infiltrate as opposed to piping it?
If you can, yeah, if you can find ways to use that water. For example, our permit, and maybe this gets at Kevin's question a little bit. Our permit says you can't infiltrate when you have de-soils. Well, if you capture that water in a pond and instead of slowly releasing it, you build it for storage, you can irrigate an athletic field at a very slower rate. A de-soil will infiltrate some water. You're just spreading it out over a larger area. So yeah, maybe some of these ponds can be converted into irrigation ponds. Maybe they can be redesigned a little bit differently. If you can infiltrate, do that instead. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that we're shifting away from ponds, which were the NERP ponds of the 90s and 2000s, and infiltration is always going to be a preferred practice, provided it doesn't have negative impacts on water quality of the groundwater below. I hope that's answers your question a little bit better.
Yes, thanks.
All right, looks like we've got 2 more questions in the chat. If you can stick around, it is 10:02. So we understand if folks have to leave, but Mike, if you have a couple more minutes, we do have 2 more questions for you.
I got plenty of time.
Okay, so Kevin is commenting on the land use, asking, should MPCA provide LGUs and others with guidance and support on land use matters? That this is an issue that isn't really on the MPCA's radar as of now.
Well, that's a good question. And the question would be, if we do that, who would do it? Our permitting programs are focused on permits. I work on the stormwater manual, so much of what I do supports those permits, but a lot of what I do doesn't, is designed for stormwater practitioners, whether they're permitted or not. I think it would be so the short answer to your question is yes, I think it's something that should be done. The question is by who, and I think maybe it's a good opportunity for different components of the agency to come together and realize how our programs overlap. For example, brownfields. If you're reclaiming a brownfield, talk to the stormwater people, talk to the RMAD people. Let's all sit down at the table and figure out what's the best use of that brownfield. How can we make it simulate? We're always going to, these systems are always going to be engineered to some extent, but how can we make it act more like a natural system? Does that get at your comment question a little bit?
I appreciate it, yes.
Okay.
All right, and then we've got another question in here from Carl, that he shares your disdain for lawns. Do you have any recommendations on bee lawns versus legume gardens versus other options for homeowners to help with infiltration? I'd put an infographic sign to educate those passing by. Are you aware of programs to plug into?
So I'm not sure I tracked all of that, but I think I get the gist of it, I hope. Well, Bowser, of course, has their incentive to switch over. I don't know exactly what, at least maybe somebody in the audience knows. But they're trying to promote different types of lawns, like clover lawns, I believe. So that's one option. Incentive programs. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's some watershed districts that are starting to encourage that. Yeah, the lawns to legumes program. I see that there. That's Bowser. Gosh, you kind of stumped me on this one. I talk about switching over. I know the university has some information on the topic, and I talk about getting rid of turf, and then you ask a question, I don't really have a good answer for you. So you kind of stumped me on. I think there's a lot out there, and I just unfortunately don't know. But I think when I'm done talking here, I'm going to start. And anybody in the audience can chime in here too if they're aware of some incentive programs out there to get people to move away from their turf. I mean, personally, I just like perennial gardens better. My yard is a mostly perennial garden. I just like it better than lawns. So there's that personal incentive. I'm not getting any financial reward for it or anything, but sorry.
Thanks, Mike. A couple people put links to lawns to legumes and something called Homegrown National Park, so I appreciate it. And one specifically for St. Paul residents.
Yeah, it's the old dog can learn new tricks sometimes. So I learned something new there.
All right, well, yeah, there's some links in the chat here to the Bowser program, the EQB pollinator report. That's actually what I was looking up too, because I was like, I thought EQB had worked a little bit on this as well. And so Sharon posted that there is, I believe, the pollinator report that would have some information, and then the great link for St. Paul folks. My neighbor has a nice little sign. They have clover as mostly as their lawn, and they have a cute little sign that says, please excuse whatever the lawn, but we're protecting the bees, or I forget exactly.
And that was mentioned in his question too, and I think that's a great idea. The more you put something out there that people can see, 9 people out of 10 are going to love it. There's going to be that one person that says, "Oh, look at that person's showing off," but who cares?
Yes. Oh, and Sharon, yes, we do post all of our recorded water issues talks. We have a water issues YouTube site that we post all of the recordings. So we will absolutely get mics up there. I am the one responsible for doing that. I'm a little behind. I've been busy with other work the last couple of months, but I'm hoping to start getting some of those recordings. I usually go in spurts where I have like a chunk of time and I just get like, 6 or 8 of them all, posted and up on that website. So I will definitely be getting to that soon. So that will be available, Mike's recording, as well as all of our past water issues talks. Another resource here, Metro Blooms. That is another good program that Karen posted. And then, it looks like we've got the link to the EQB pollinator report as well. Well, unless we've got more questions for Mike about his presentation, we can wrap up here since we are a little past time. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and a big thank you to Mike for this presentation, for getting us all to think. I think that's been something that I've had the privilege to work with Mike over my entire 15 careers here, and I have learned that how do we push, the agency to think outside the box and kind of continue to grow and change and adapt to meeting environmental needs. And so I've appreciated that perspective that, Mike, I think you've always done a great job of for the agency. And so it was great to have this last water issues presentation from you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Mike. Great talk.
Yeah.
As usual, learn a lot.
Y'all have a great day. Thank you.